Today, I'm going to replace the fluorescent lights in my ceiling with LED bulbs. And the particular LED bulbs I'm going to use are called single-ended ballast bypass bulbs. Now, just to describe the term a little bit, what they mean by single-ended is that you energize these bulbs by applying a signal, a voltage, across the two pins on one end of the bulb. And in fact, it turns out that the signal we're going to provide here is standard 60 Hertz, 110 volt AC power. So we work off standard line power. These particular bulbs come from Sunco, and at least on the Sunco bulbs, the way you tell which end of the bulb is the end for the power is that's the end that has the writing on it. The opposite end has no writing. So it's the writing end that you want to energize. What they mean by ballast bypass on these bulbs is that these bulbs do not need a ballast to operate. In fact, they won't work in a fixture with a ballast. So what we have to do is bypass the ballast, basically splice around it in order to make these lights work. In fact, as you'll see in my case, what I'm going to do is actually remove the ballast from the ceiling. And while I've got the bulb in my hands here, I just want to point out a couple more things about it. First thing is that on the opposite ends, the pins here are just dummies. They're not there for any kind of electrical signal. They're simply there to allow you to mount the bulb in a standard fluorescent light outlet. The other thing about the bulbs, you'll notice there is a strip inside the bulb that runs the length of the bulb. That's where the LED lights are. So when you mount this bulb in the ceiling, you'll be sticking it up and turning it at 90 degrees. What you want to have happen is that when you've got the bulb mounted, you want this strip to be at the top of the fixture so that the LED lights are shining down. Okay, so the basic thing we're trying to do today is just replace the existing fluorescent with these LED bulbs. What I'm going to do next is go ahead and go up and take out the existing fluorescent bulbs, pop the covers off the fixtures. Nothing too exciting to see there, so I'm going to shut down the camera and I'll come back when we can take a look at what's inside the fixture. Okay, since I turned off the camera, all I've done is first turn off the power to make sure that everything's safe. And then I've gone up and I've removed the fluorescent bulbs from the fixture just by turning the bulbs 90 degrees and sliding them out. And after the bulbs were gone, I also popped the covers off the fixture. In my case, it's very easy. All I gotta do is push it in and pull it back out and the cover is off. Yours might require a screw or some sort of latch, but the covers come off pretty easily. Now, what you can see up here are the two key elements of the circuit. This black thing with all the wires going in and out of it, that's the ballast that is used to regulate the voltage for fluorescent bulbs. As I mentioned earlier, the ballast is not required for my LED lights, so basically what I'm going to do is remove that from the circuit. The other thing up here that we have to worry about are these things over here, which are the one end of the sockets that we plug the bulbs into. Now it turns out this is the end of the socket that I am going to apply power to. So this is where we're going to get the juice for our LED bulbs. And for reasons that you'll see in a minute when we take a closer look at these things, they are called tombstones. Now it turns out for these fluorescent bulbs, the way the fluorescent bulbs work is that they apply the voltage across the bulb. And as I mentioned a couple minutes earlier, what we're going to try and do is provide voltage across the pins at one end of the bulb. And what that means, the bottom line on that is that the way these tombstones are currently wired won't work for my LED bulbs. So in addition to removing the ballast, I've also got to remove the tombstones and rewire them and then put them back up there. Okay, so all I'm going to do now is go up and remove the ballast, remove the tombstones, and I'm going to slide the camera out a little bit so you can have some idea of what's going on. Okay, so again, my first step up here, my next step is to come up and cut all the wires on this ballast. And as I cut these wires off, I'm going to leave a couple of inches on each end. And the only reason I'm doing that is on the outside chance I might want to use this ballast again, I want to have enough wire up there that I can splice onto it. Okay, all the wires to the ballast are removed. The way this ballast is mounted is it's got a single nut that's holding it up tight against the ceiling. The odds are good that I'll be dropping this nut on the floor any second now. There we go, it's in my ratchet. So ballast is out. And the next thing I'm going to do, all I have to do is pop these two plates that have the tombstones in them out, because I'm going to bring them down and rewire them. And if you look up here now, all that's left up here in the ceiling, besides that yellow wire, which isn't going to do anything for us, but I've got two wires left up here, this black and white wire. That's my power. That's what I'm going to use to power my bulbs. Okay, so let's start rewiring some tombstones. Okay, since I turned off the camera, I've done a couple of things. One is that I cut the wires off of my tombstones so that I can reuse them. In fact, what I've done with those wires is I've kept two of them. These are the two wires I'm going to use to connect to my power up above. And I've taken the other two wires and I've cut them up into 6 smaller wires, 3 red, 3 blue. And I'm going to use these to wire my tombstones together, as you'll see in just a second. And for all of these wires, what I've done is I've stripped the insulation off the ends so that it'll be easy to make my connections. And then one final thing I did while the camera was off is I went back up on the ladder and I stripped the ends of the insulation off the ends of the power line so they'll be ready to connect as soon as I go up there. Okay, now it turns out in the world of tombstones there are 2 basic types. They're called shunted and unshunted. Shunted just means that the 2 prongs on opposite sides of the tombstone are shunted together. There's a small piece of metal in there that shunts the current between those 2 prongs. Unshunted means that there's no such piece of wire. There's in fact an open circuit between the 2 prongs. Now it turns out that for my fluorescent lights that I'm replacing, I needed to have shunted tombstones. So these tombstones that are currently in place are all shunted. In order to put a voltage across the pins of my LED lamps, I need to have unshunted tombstones. So basically I have to change out my tombstones. Now I suppose I could pry this shunted tombstone apart and remove the shunt and reuse this, but just to make life a little simpler, I've purchased a new set of unshunted tombstones that I'm going to use for this job. So now all I want to do is wire for these lights. Okay, so shunted tombstones are out. All I'm going to do is slide into these same slots my new unshunted tombstones. And in order to make the wiring up above simpler, that's backwards. In order to make the wiring up above simpler, I am going to energize the back-to-back tombstones. That way I won't need to get any wiring at all to the far ends of either light, and all the power I need can be on these back-to-back tombstones. Okay, we're all inserted in our slots. That'll be a little easier. Okay, now, so I'm going to place these back up in the ceiling like this, back to back. And while we're down here on the ground and it's a bit simpler, I'm going to go ahead and wire them. Now the idea here is I need to get the standard 110 volt signal across all 4 of these sockets. So I'm going to use this first one here on the right as the tombstone that I'm going to link to the power line. So I'm going to just shove in that blue wire in that, and I'm going to shove in the red wire for the other prong. Okay, now to get power to the other tombstones, I'm going to basically daisy chain them together. So I'm going to take one of my little blue shunt wires, plug it into the other port of the first tombstone, and then plug it into the first port of the second tombstone. And then I'm similarly going to take a red wire, plug it into the first port of the first tombstone, and then into the first port of the second tombstone. And by the way, I should mention, I'm trying to keep these aligned. It really doesn't matter so long as you get opposite voltages across the pins. Okay, so now the first 2 are wired together. Next, I want to wire to the back. So I'm going to take another blue wire. I should also mention it really doesn't matter. These wires are all the same color. It's just easier for me to keep track that way. So I'm going to take the blue wire and wire it into the, in this case, the left tombstone on the back. And I'm going to take a red wire, this is a little shorter. I'm going to take a red wire and similarly plug it into the opposite port on the back. And then finally I want to connect to the final tombstone. So I'm going to take a blue wire, stick it in that socket, and I'll bring that over here. And then finally a red wire, which I'll place here, and insert that into the red wire over here. Okay, so again, all I've done is I've installed 2 wires that I'm going to use to connect to the 2 power lines up in the ceiling. And then once I've got those 2 in, then I've simply daisy chained that same power to each of the other tombstones. So now all that really is left to do is back up to the ceiling, put these in place, wire nut these wires to the power, and I should be good to go. Okay, so hopefully I won't fumble around with this too much up here, but I'm taking the ends of my brackets, cutting out here, and I just want to slide these back into their slots. And so I'm going to stick them in the slots on the far end. And once they're in their slots there, make sure the wires are shoved up inside. And I'm going to prop them into their slots on this end. Sometimes easier said than done. First one. Okay, tombstones are in place. The only thing I've got to do now is wire these guys together. And again, which wire goes where doesn't really matter. But I've been following the convention of connecting blues to blacks and reds to whites. So there's the blue and the black. And I'm just going to hold those 2 ends together. Slide them into a wire nut. Give this wire nut several turns. Make sure we have a good secure connection. I'm going to make sure I'm even turning the wire a few times outside the nut so I can be confident it's not going to fall off on me. Okay, so there's the first one. Now let's do the second one. two exposed wires, holding them together. Holding them together for a while anyway. Now I got them back together. Slide them inside the nut. Give the nut several turns. And that should be it. Now, before I put this whole fixture back together, what I want to do is a test. So for the test, I'm going to bring up just one bulb and put it in the outlet and make sure that that bulb lights. And the reason I can get by with a single bulb test is I'm going to put the single bulb in this outlet over here. And the reason for that, if you remember my daisy chaining, is my daisy chain goes from this tombstone to this one, and to this one, and then finally to this fourth one over here. So if I get light on this fourth one, I know I'm going to be okay on the others because I'm at the end of the line down here in this one over in the corner. So let me go get a bulb, put it into the socket, and see what we get. Okay, to save you the drama of wondering whether or not the bulb is going to work, and me the embarrassment if it doesn't work, I went ahead and inserted the bulb and turned on the juice. And as you can see, my bulb in that fourth most vulnerable outlet is working. So it looks like the rewiring has been a success. What I'm going to do now is go ahead and turn the camera back off, put the fixture back together, and I'll come back and summarize what the overall job has been and talk a little bit about whether this makes any financial sense. Okay, so I've put covers back on the fixtures. I've put bulbs in each of the 4 sockets, turned on the switch, and the lights are working. So job is complete except for the cleanup. Okay, just as a reminder, when I installed these bulbs, I made sure I took the end with the writing on it, the printing on it, and put that into the center tombstone because that's where we wired the power. And then when I stuck them into the outlet, I had the pins vertical to slide up into the socket. And then when I rotated the bulb 90 degrees to fix it in place, I made sure that at the end of the rotation, this strip with the LED lights on it was at the top so that the LEDs are shining down. Okay, so to just quickly summarize, it took us a while, took me a while, but all I really did was open up the fixture, remove the ballast by cutting all the wires off the ballast. I removed the tombstones in the center only. The other ones are okay because they're just there to hold the light in place. But I removed the center tombstones because I had to rewire them and actually replace them from shunted to unshunted tombstones, and then daisy chain the wiring so that I could get the power to all 4 of the outlets to handle the 4 bulbs. Once that was done, just rewiring the tombstones, eliminating the ballast, all I had to do was splice some wires together and we were done. Now, when I started this project, I wanted to convert to LED just because I thought it was a good thing to reduce my power consumption. But I wondered whether it was also a good financial thing to do. So I did some back-of-the-envelope calculations. And it turns out I got a pretty good deal on these bulbs. I paid roughly $3 per bulb. These particular bulbs are 18 watts and 2200 lumens. And if you're curious about the color temperature, there are 5000 K bulbs. Let me put it down before I break it by slamming it into something. The bulbs that I was replacing, the fluorescent bulbs, are 32 watts. Plus the ballast itself consumes some power. Now I have to admit, I don't know exactly how much power my particular ballast uses. But I made based on just a wee little bit of web research, I made the assumption that my ballast is consuming 12 watts when it's turned on, when the lights are on. And the reason I picked that number 12 is it makes the math easier. Boils down to roughly 3 additional watts per bulb. So in net, the fluorescent bulbs are consuming 35 watts when they're turned on versus 18 on my LED bulbs. So I'm saving 17 watts when the lights are switched. Okay, so 17 watts of power savings. It turns out that my incremental cost for power consumption is 10.5 cents per kilowatt hour. As I mentioned, I paid $3 per bulb. And then finally, I'm making the assumption that I am going to have these lights turned on average over a year, an average of 2 hours a day. If I take all those numbers and crank through them, what it comes out is that it looks like I would break even, in other words, cover the cost of the bulbs, at roughly 2 years and 3 or 4 months. So in less than 2.5 years, these bulbs pay for themselves. If you have the lights on for longer periods per day, you're going to break even sooner. If you don't have your lights on as often, obviously it's going to take longer for the bulbs to prove in. But it looks like within a relatively short period, these bulbs become cost effective. On top of that, the bulbs provide better light. These are clearly, to me, compared to the fluorescent that I replaced, they're clearly brighter. I like the higher color temperature, it makes things easier to see in here. I also don't have to wait on the bulbs to warm up. The bulbs never hum. These particular bulbs are rated at 50,000 hours of life versus 15,000 hours for the typical fluorescent bulb, so they're going to last 3 times as long. At 50,000 hours of light, if I use these lights for 2 hours a day, they're going to last for more than 50 years, which means obviously I am never going to know whether these bulbs last their entire 50,000 year lifetime or not. But besides power savings, there's lots of other reasons to switch over in terms of lifetime, better light. Also, if you get clumsy and break one of these bulbs, LEDs, I don't have mercury coming out of them like I do with the fluorescents. So that's my sales pitch for why you ought to switch over to fluorescent. So I hope that this video has provided you some ideas or insights into how to change over your lighting, and I wish you good luck on your LED conversion project.